Heavy rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the penthouse, drowning out the frantic pulse of the city below. For a man who controlled the eastern seaboard's underworld, absolute power felt remarkably like solitary confinement. Victor Calogero sat in the suffocating silence of his sprawling estate on the precise day he turned 40. Beyond his heavy oak doors stood a small army of armed loyalists, while his encrypted devices hummed with offshore wire transfers and political blackmail. Yet, amidst a multi-billion-dollar empire and a reputation that commanded sheer terror, not a single living soul reached out to wish him well. He had spent 2 decades meticulously turning his heart into an impenetrable fortress of ice. He fully believed nothing could ever breach those walls until a desperate, trespassing maid and her 2 small children accidentally stumbled out of the shadows. Victor Calogero adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, his expression as unreadable as the slate-gray sky looming over the industrial shipyards of Newark. The warehouse smelled of salt, damp concrete, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the welding equipment resting in the corner. Before him sat Richard Sterling, a mid-level distributor who had made the fatal miscalculation of skimming off the top of the Calogero Syndicate's port operations. "3 million, Ricky," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that didn't need to be raised to command the cavernous room. "You thought $3 million would just go unnoticed in a ledger?" Richard was trembling, tied securely to a heavy steel chair. "Victor, please. I have a family. I have girls. I can pay it back, with interest. Just give me a month. 1 month." Victor looked away, staring out the grime-caked window toward the docks. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel the fiery rage that his father, Giovanni, used to exhibit. He just felt an exhausting, bone-deep weariness. This was the burden of the crown. You didn't punish people out of malice. You did it to maintain the architecture of fear that kept the whole empire from collapsing. "You invoked your family to justify stealing from mine," Victor replied softly, turning back. He gestured to his underboss, Carmine De Luca, a man whose eyes held all the warmth of a frozen lake. "Handle it, Carmine, cleanly. I don't want a mess for the Port Authority to find tomorrow." Victor walked out before Richard could scream. He climbed into the back of his armored Maybach S600, the heavy door thudding shut and instantly severing him from the noise of the outside world. "To the Alpine estate, Mr. Calogero?" His driver, Thomas, asked respectfully. "Yes. Take the scenic route," Victor murmured, resting his head against the rich leather seats. As the luxury vehicle glided onto the New Jersey Turnpike, Victor pulled back his sleeve to check his Patek Philippe Nautilus. It was 8 p.m., October 14th. Today was his 40th birthday. Not that anyone knew, or cared. In his world, a birthday was a vulnerability. It was a date enemies could use to predict your location. A day when men let their guard down to celebrate. His father had taught him to erase personal milestones. A boss has no birth date, Victor. He simply is. But his father was dead, gunned down outside a bakery in Bensonhurst 12 years ago, leaving Victor to inherit a fractured syndicate and weld it back together with ruthless efficiency. He had succeeded. He was richer than some sovereign nations. He owned politicians, judges, and a sprawling portfolio of legitimate real estate spanning from Manhattan to Miami. Yet, as the Maybach passed through the towering wrought iron gates of his Alpine, New Jersey estate, he had never felt more isolated. The property was a fortress, disguised as a modern architectural marvel. Security cameras tracked the car's movement. Armed guards in tactical gear patrolled the perimeter with Belgian Malinois dogs. Victor stepped out into the biting autumn wind and entered his home. It was 30,000 square feet of imported Italian marble, vaulted ceilings, and priceless contemporary art. It was perfectly pristine, meticulously curated, and entirely devoid of life. His staff, professionals who were paid exorbitant salaries to be practically invisible, had already retreated to their quarters. Victor took off his suit jacket, tossing it over a custom velvet sofa. He walked into the kitchen, a stainless steel chef's paradise that had never seen a home-cooked meal, and poured himself a glass of filtered water. His phone vibrated. A text from Detective Miller, a high-ranking officer on his payroll. Cargo secured at Pier 4. Mayor says thank you for the campaign contribution. Victor locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the counter. 40 years old. He possessed enough power to bring the city to its knees, but he didn't have a single person in the world who would look him in the eye and say, "Happy birthday." He walked toward his private study, the only room in the house that felt remotely comfortable, preparing to drink himself to sleep. 30 miles away, in a cramped, drafty apartment in Yonkers, Nora Gallagher was fighting a losing battle against despair. At 28, Nora had the exhausted, hollowed-out look of a woman who had spent the last 5 years carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her husband, David, had been a charming dreamer who turned out to be a degenerate gambler. 3 years ago, he ran afoul of some incredibly dangerous men, loan sharks, connected to the very syndicates Nora only heard about in whispered rumors. One night, David packed a duffel bag and vanished, leaving Nora with $70,000 in debt, eviction notices, and 2 small children. "Mommy, my chest is tight again," Oliver whispered from the futon in the living room. The 6-year-old was clutching his threadbare blanket, his breathing carrying a faint, terrifying wheeze. Nora rushed to his side, pulling his prescription inhaler from her apron pocket. "Here, sweetie." Deep breaths. In through your mouth, just like the doctor showed us. She watched anxiously as Oliver took the medication, his small chest rising and falling until the wheezing subsided. Standing nearby, 8-year-old Lily watched with wide, worried eyes. "Is Ollie going to be okay?" Lily asked softly. "He's going to be just fine, Bug." Nora forced a smile, though her stomach twisted into knots. She had $14.50 in her checking account. Oliver's next round of medication cost $80. Her cheap prepaid phone began to ring, jarring her nerves. The caller ID flashed Hudson Valley Cleaners, Brenda. Nora answered quickly. "Hello, Brenda?" "Nora, I know it's late, but I'm in a massive bind." Her supervisor's voice crackled through the speaker. "We got an emergency call from the Calogero estate in Alpine. The main house needs a deep clean in the west wing immediately. Someone spilled, well, let's just say a lot of dark red wine on a very expensive Persian rug. The regular staff isn't cleared for this kind of late-night intrusion. I need you. Double time, plus a hazard bonus." Nora's heart leaped. Double time and a hazard bonus meant she could afford the inhalers, groceries for the week, and maybe even chip away at the electric bill. "I'll do it." "But Brenda, Mrs. Higgins canceled on me tonight." She threw her back out. "I don't have anyone to watch the kids." "Nora, you know the rules," Brenda sighed, sounding exasperated. "No unauthorized personnel on client properties, especially this client. Do you know who owns that estate?" "I know it's a wealthy businessman," Nora said evasively. She knew the rumors. Everyone in the tri-state area knew the name Calogero. "It's a mafia fortress, Nora. If you bring your kids and they get seen, I can't even protect you. I'll lose the contract, and you could lose a lot more than your job." "I'll keep them in the service quarters," Nora pleaded, desperation bleeding into her voice. "In the walk-in pantry. It's huge, and the staff is gone for the night. They'll be completely silent. Please, Brenda. I need this money to keep my son breathing." A long pause hung on the line. "Fine. But if you get caught, I never gave you permission." "God help you, Nora." 30 minutes later, Nora loaded Lily and Oliver into her sputtering 2008 Honda Civic. The heater had broken 2 winters ago, so she wrapped them in heavy blankets for the drive across the George Washington Bridge and into the secluded, impossibly wealthy enclaves of Alpine. When she pulled up to the towering iron gates of the estate, her hands shook on the steering wheel. A heavily armed guard, a man named Rocco with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, approached the window. He shined a blinding flashlight into her face, completely ignoring the 2 small lumps huddled under blankets in the back seat. "Name: Nora Gallagher. Hudson Valley Cleaners," she squeaked, handing him her ID badge. Rocco scrutinized it, checked a tablet, and nodded. "Service entrance is around back. You stick to the West Wing corridor and the service kitchen. You don't wander. You don't look at anything you don't need to look at. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Nora breathed. The gates swung open, revealing a driveway longer than Nora's entire street back in Yonkers. She parked near the service doors, hurriedly ushering Lily and Oliver inside. The sheer scale of the house was overwhelming. The ceilings soared high above them, and even the service hallways were lined with immaculate tile. She found the massive walk-in pantry off the secondary kitchen. It was larger than her bedroom, lined with shelves of imported dry goods, cases of sparkling water, and sacks of flour. "Okay, listen to me," Nora whispered, kneeling to eye level with her children. She handed Lily a cracked tablet. "This has 20% battery. You can watch 2 episodes of your cartoon, but the volume stays on mute. You do not leave this room. We are playing the quiet game. If you win, Mommy gets to buy Ollie his medicine tomorrow. I'm a good hider, Mommy, Oliver whispered back, settling onto a soft 50-pound bag of rice. I know you are, baby. Lily, you're in charge. Do not open this door. Nora kissed their foreheads, locked the pantry from the outside with a heavy sigh, and grabbed her cleaning caddy. She had a stain to scrub, and she prayed to God she would remain entirely invisible. The grandfather clock in the grand hallway chimed 11 times. The deep, resonant sound echoed through the cavernous estate, eventually reaching the mahogany-paneled walls of Victor's private study. Victor sat behind a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark walnut. The room was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by a brass desk lamp and the amber glow of the fire crackling in the hearth. Before him sat a crystal tumbler filled with 2 fingers of Macallan 25. He swirled the amber liquid, watching it catch the light, before raising it in a mock toast to the empty room. Happy 40th, Vic, he murmured. His voice sounded painfully loud in the oppressive silence. King of the graveyard. He downed the scotch, letting the burn distract him from the hollow ache in his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold Zippo lighter, running his thumb over the intricate engraving of the Calogero family crest. His father had given it to him on his 18th birthday. It was the last time he remembered feeling like he belonged to something resembling a family. Since taking over the syndicate, he had become a god to his men, a monster to his enemies, and a stranger to himself. Down the hall, Nora was on her hands and knees in the West Wing parlor. The spilled wine Brenda had mentioned was, unequivocally, not wine. It had a distinctly metallic smell and had soaked deep into the intricate threads of the Persian rug. Nora didn't ask questions. She applied the hydrogen peroxide and industrial stain remover, scrubbing with a stiff bristled brush until her knuckles ached and her fingernails cracked. The physical labor was grueling, but she welcomed the distraction. It kept her mind off the sheer terror of being inside the belly of the beast. Meanwhile, inside the pantry, disaster had struck. The tablet screen blinked, stuttered, and faded to black. It died, Lily whispered, setting the device down on a crate of canned tomatoes. Oliver, exhausted from his earlier asthma attack, had already fallen fast asleep, his head resting against Lily's leg. Lily sat in the dark for a few minutes, the silence of the massive house pressing in on her. Her throat felt dry, really dry. She looked around the pantry. There were hundreds of bottles of Pellegrino on the upper shelves, but they were far out of her reach. Remembering that her mother was just down the hall, Lily carefully stood up, making sure not to wake Oliver. She approached the heavy pantry door. Nora had locked it from the outside, but it was a simple latch mechanism designed to keep the door from swinging open, not a deadbolt. A firm push from the inside unseated the latch, and the door clicked open. Lily slipped out into the dim service corridor. She was a tiny figure in a faded yellow sundress, her bare feet padding silently against the cold tile. "Mommy?" she whispered. She walked past the secondary kitchen, stepping into the grand hallway. The sheer magnitude of the estate was dizzying. Towering columns, massive oil paintings, and shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Lily, completely lacking the self-preservation instincts of an adult who knew what this house represented, simply wandered toward the source of light spilling from beneath a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. She pushed the door open. It creaked softly on its brass hinges. Victor froze. The sound was microscopic, but in a life governed by paranoia, any unexpected noise was a threat. His hand moved with lightning speed, slipping beneath the desk and wrapping around the cold, textured grip of his Sig Sauer P-226. He drew the weapon, holding it out of sight beneath the edge of the desk, his muscles coiled to spring. "Who's there?" Victor demanded, his voice slicing through the quiet room like a blade. The door pushed open a little wider. A head of messy blonde hair appeared, followed by 2 large, curious blue eyes. Victor blinked. He tightened his grip on the gun, his brain struggling to process the visual information. He was expecting an assassin from the Sterling crew, a DEA raid, or a rogue guard. He was not expecting a little girl who barely cleared the height of his doorknobs. Lily stepped fully into the room, staring at the towering, broad-shouldered man behind the desk. She noticed the deep scar running along his jawline, the dark circles under his eyes, and the empty glass in his hand. Victor slowly, carefully, placed the gun back into its holster beneath the desk. How did you get in here? He asked, his voice softer now, but still laced with deep confusion and authority. The door was unlocked, Lily answered matter-of-factly. Are you the man who owns this big castle? Victor stared at her, completely disarmed by her lack of fear. Children usually cried when they looked at him. Adults usually trembled. This tiny creature in a worn-out dress was looking at him with nothing but mild curiosity. It's not a castle, Victor said, leaning forward slightly. And you shouldn't be here. Where are your parents? Mommy is cleaning. She told me to stay in the closet, but my throat is scratchy, and the iPad died. Lily walked closer, stopping just a few feet from his desk. She tilted her head, studying his face. Are you sad? You look like my mommy when she cries in the bathroom when she thinks we can't hear her. The observation hit Victor with the force of a physical blow, the absolute, unfiltered honesty of a child slicing straight through decades of psychological armor. He opened his mouth to tell her to leave, to summon his guards to throw whoever had brought a child into his house out onto the street. But the words died in his throat. Today is my birthday, Victor found himself saying. He had no idea why he was telling her. He hadn't spoken those words aloud to another living soul in 15 years. But no one remembered. So, yes, I suppose I am a little sad. Lily's eyes widened in genuine sympathy. Nobody remembered? Not even your mommy? My mother passed away a long time ago, Victor replied, the tightness in his chest expanding. Before Lily could respond, a muffled sound of pure, unadulterated panic echoed from the hallway. Rapid footsteps slapped against the marble floors, growing louder and more frantic. Lily! Lily! Nora's voice tore through the silence of the estate, shrill and utterly terrified. Nora rounded the corner and skidded to a halt in the open doorway of the study. She was covered in sweat, her apron stained with harsh chemicals. When her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw her daughter standing 3 feet away from Victor Calagero. Nora knew exactly who he was. She had seen his face on the news, always accompanied by words like indictment, organized crime, and ruthless. The air in her lungs evaporated. The rumors about this man were the stuff of nightmares. He was the devil of Alpine, a man who allegedly made entire families disappear for crossing him. Driven by primal, maternal instinct, Nora didn't think. She sprinted across the room, grabbed Lily by the shoulders, and threw the child behind her. Nora planted herself firmly between the Mafia boss and her daughter, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with animalistic terror. Please, Nora gasped, her voice breaking as she held her hands up defensively. Tears instantly streamed down her cheeks. Please, Mr. Calagero. She's just a little girl. She didn't mean any harm. She was thirsty. I brought her because my sitter canceled, and I needed the money for my son's asthma medicine. I swear to God she hasn't seen anything. Victor sat perfectly still, observing the woman trembling violently before him. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, the way her body instinctively shielded the child, offering herself as a sacrifice without a second thought. Please, Nora sobbed, falling to her knees but keeping her arms stretched out to block Lily. Kill me, do whatever you want to me, but please, let her go. I beg of you. Victor felt a profound, seismic shift within his chest. He lived in a world of transactional loyalty. Men swore their lives to him because he paid them, or because they feared him. He hadn't seen an act of pure, selfless love, someone genuinely willing to die for another since his own mother shielded him from an abusive, drunken uncle 30 years ago. He slowly stood up. He was 6'3", broad and imposing in his dark suit. Nora flinched, closing her eyes tight, waiting for the gunshot or the blow. Instead, Victor walked around his desk, moving with slow, deliberate steps so as not to startle her further. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at them. Get up, Victor commanded, though the harsh edge had entirely left his voice. It was shockingly gentle. Nora slowly opened her eyes, paralyzed by fear. I said, get up, Victor repeated, offering a large, calloused hand. Nora hesitated, but the authority in his tone left no room for argument. She took his hand, expecting him to crush her fingers, but his grip was surprisingly careful as he helped her to her feet. She immediately pulled Lily flush against her leg. You brought your children into my home, uninvited, while working a contracted job, Victor stated, his dark eyes locked onto Nora's panicked face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know the rules. But, Victor interrupted, raising a hand to silence her. He looked past Nora to the little girl peering out from behind her mother's apron. Your daughter is the only person who has spoken to me today without wanting money, power, or a favor. Lily tugged on Nora's apron. Mommy, the sad man said, it's his birthday today, but nobody remembered. Nora blinked, completely derailed by the statement. She looked from her daughter to the terrifying mob boss, her brain struggling to reconcile the feared kingpin with the concept of a lonely, forgotten birthday. His birthday? Yes, Lily said. She wriggled out from behind her mother and reached into the deep, oversized pocket of her own faded dress. Mommy bought a cupcake today for Ollie's birthday tomorrow because it was half price at the bakery. But Ollie is asleep. Lily pulled out a squashed, slightly mangled vanilla cupcake wrapped in cheap plastic. The frosting was smeared against the wrapper, and a single, bent blue candle was shoved into the center. She held it out toward Victor. You can have it, Lily offered, her voice bright and sincere in the gloomy room. So you aren't sad anymore. Victor stared at the crushed, discount store pastry being offered by a child who, minutes ago, her mother had claimed couldn't even afford medical care. The contrast between his billion-dollar empire and this mangled, heartfelt offering was staggering. The sheer, unadulterated humanity of the gesture shattered the remaining ice around his heart. Victor dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with the little girl. He ignored Nora's sharp intake of breath as he carefully reached out and took the squashed cupcake from Lily's tiny hand. Thank you, Lily, Victor said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. He looked up at Nora, who was staring at him in complete disbelief. I think I'd like to help you with that medical bill. Morning sunlight failed to pierce the heavy velvet drapes of the Alpine estate. But inside the East Wing's guest suite, a different kind of light had broken through. Nora Gallagher sat on the edge of a California king bed, watching a private pediatric specialist drilled in discretion and flown in by helicopter at 2 a.m. listen to her son's lungs. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a former chief resident at Mount Sinai Hospital who now operated exclusively for New York's elite, packed away his gold-plated stethoscope. The boy has severe bronchial asthma, Mrs. Gallagher, Dr. Pendleton said, his tone brisk but not unkind. He's been chronically undermedicated. I've administered a high-dose corticosteroid and set up a nebulizer station in the adjoining bathroom. I'll have a supply of fluticasone and albuterol delivered from a private pharmacy in Manhattan by noon. He will be perfectly fine, provided he stays in a clean, stress-free environment. Nora nodded numbly, her hands tightly gripping the luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets. Thank you, doctor. I don't know how I'll ever repay this. You don't have to. A deep voice resonated from the doorway. Victor Calogero stood there, having shed his bespoke suit for a simple black cashmere sweater and dark slacks. He looked less like a mob boss and more like a weary titan taking a momentary rest. Beside him stood Carmine DeLuca, his underboss, whose jaw was clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. Dr. Pendleton packed his leather bag, gave a curt nod to Victor, and hurried past the men, escorted by a silent guard. Mr. Calogero, Nora began, standing up, her maternal instincts warring with her ingrained fear of the man. You saved my son tonight, but we can't stay here. The people looking for my husband, they are dangerous. If they find out I'm hiding in a mansion in Bergen County, who is looking for your husband? Victor interrupted softly, stepping into the room. He glanced at little Lily, who was fast asleep on a nearby chaise lounge, clutching a newly gifted teddy bear. Nora swallowed hard. David, my husband. He had a gambling problem. He got in deep with some men operating out of a social club in Queens. A man named Dominic Russo. They said David owed them $70,000. When David ran, Russo's men came to my apartment. They broke my windows. They told me I inherited the debt. At the mention of Dominic Russo, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Carmine shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward Victor. Dominic, the Viper Russo, Victor murmured, his jaw hardening. Russo wasn't just a random loan shark. He was a capo in the Lucchese family, a rival faction that had been pushing the boundaries of the fragile truce Victor had established 5 years ago. Extorting a civilian mother and her children over a runner's debt was exactly the kind of dishonorable, street-level garbage Victor despised. Carmine, Victor said, not taking his eyes off Nora. I want Harrison to run a full background on David Gallagher. Find out exactly how much he borrowed, how much he lost, and where he vanished to. Then, I want you to send a message to Russo's people. Nora Gallagher's debt is paid in full, by me. If they so much as look at her apartment in Yonkers, I'll burn their social club to the ground. Carmine stepped forward, lowering his voice. Boss, with all due respect, we are in the middle of negotiating the port contracts with the Lucchese family. You want to start a war over a maid and a 70 grand gambling debt? This is bad business. Victor turned his head slowly, his dead-eyed stare freezing Carmine in his tracks. A man who preys on children to collect a debt has no business sitting at my table. Send the message, Carmine, and have Nora's belongings moved here. She is the new live-in estate manager. The children will be enrolled in the Rockland Country Day School, paid through my private trust. Carmine gritted his teeth, bowed his head slightly, and left the room to make the calls. Nora was hyperventilating, her mind struggling to process the monumental shift in her reality. Estate manager? Mr. Calogero, I clean houses. I don't know how to run a 30,000 square foot compound. You managed to keep 2 children alive and loved while drowning in debt and running from the mob. Nora, Victor said, his gaze softening as he looked at her. For the first time, he noticed the faint dusting of freckles across her nose and the fierce, protective fire in her green eyes. I think you can handle ordering groceries and managing the landscaping crew. Welcome to Alpine. 3 weeks later, the Alpine estate had undergone a subtle but undeniable transformation. The mausoleum-like silence that had suffocated Victor for years was broken by the occasional sound of cartoons playing in the media room, the clatter of baking pans in the massive chef's kitchen, and the sight of a little girl drawing chalk flowers on the reinforced concrete of the secure motor court. Victor found himself returning home earlier from his business meetings. He sat in his study, leaving the oak door cracked open, just to hear the rhythm of life outside. He had paid off Nora's debt with a single phone call, terrifying Russo's enforcers into complete submission. He had hired the best tutors for Lily and the finest pulmonary specialists for Oliver. In return, Nora had brought warmth to a fortress of ice. She cooked actual meals, shepherd's pie, roasted chicken, things that smelled like a real home, and insisted Victor eat with them at the massive dining table. It was a dangerous domestic illusion, and the underworld was taking notice. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, Victor was sitting in the back booth of an exclusive, dimly lit steakhouse in Manhattan, holding a clandestine meeting with Harrison Cole, his top intelligence gatherer. I found David Gallagher, Harrison said, sliding a manila folder across the polished mahogany table. Harrison was a former NSA analyst who had traded government surveillance for syndicate money. He's in Las Vegas, living under the name Daniel Vaughn. Working as a dealer at a low-end off-strip casino, he's completely abandoned his family. Victor opened the file, looking at the surveillance photos of the man who had left Nora to the wolves. A cold fury coiled in his stomach. Does he have any active ties to Russo? No, he's totally off the board, Harrison replied, taking a sip of his scotch. But Victor, we have a bigger problem. Russo didn't take your intervention well. Word on the street is that Dominic is using your charity as a sign of weakness. He's quietly meeting with the heads of the Colombo and Gambino families. He's telling them you've gone soft, that you're playing house with a civilian maid while the port operations are bleeding money. Let them talk, Victor said dismissively, closing the folder. A lion doesn't lose sleep over the opinions of sheep. This isn't just talk, boss, Harrison leaned in, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Carmine DeLuca was seen leaving a sit-down at a restaurant in Little Italy last night. The restaurant is owned by Russo's brother-in-law. Victor's hand stopped halfway to his glass. The silence between the two men stretched, heavy and lethal. Carmine, his underboss, the man who had stood beside his father 12 years ago. If Carmine was conspiring with Russo, it wasn't just a rumor of a coup. It was an active assassination plot. Before Victor could formulate his next move, his encrypted phone vibrated. It was Nora. He answered immediately, his heart doing a strange, unfamiliar stutter. Nora, is everything all right? Victor, Nora said, her voice trembling, attempting to maintain a facade of calm. Over the past 3 weeks, they had dropped the formalities, finding a quiet, undeniable connection in the late-night hours when the house was asleep. I'm at the pediatric clinic on the Upper East Side. We just finished Oliver's checkup. I told you to take Rocco and the armored SUV, Victor said, his tactical mind instantly snapping into gear. I did, Nora whispered, the fear now palpable. But Victor, Rocco isn't here. I came out to the parking garage, and the SUV is gone, and there's a black Lincoln town car idling near the exit. Two men just got out. They're walking toward us. Victor shot out of the booth, throwing $100 bill on the table. Nora, listen to me carefully. Take the kids back inside the clinic. Go to the security desk and tell them to lock down the floor. Do not hang up this phone. He sprinted out of the restaurant, ignoring the startled waiters, his mind racing. Rocco was Carmine's man. If Rocco had abandoned the detail, the hit was already in motion. They weren't coming for Victor. They were coming for the only vulnerability he had left in the world. They were coming to make the king of the graveyard watch his new world burn. I'm coming, Nora, Victor growled, ripping open the door to his waiting Maybach and pulling his Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster. Hold on. Panic tasted exactly like copper and old dust in Nora's mouth. She dragged Lily and the exhausted Oliver down the sterile, brightly lit corridor, her sneakers squeaking frantically against the polished linoleum. They ducked behind the heavy, lead-lined, reinforced doors of the clinic's pediatric imaging wing just as a sickening crash echoed from the lobby. The security guard on duty, an older man named Stan, who always kept lollipops in his breast pocket, had seen the black Lincoln pull up on the security monitors and instantly triggered the magnetic lockdown. But the decorative glass surrounding the main reception area was only standard grade, completely useless against men who brought crowbars and silenced weapons. Get under the console, right now. Do not make a sound, Nora whispered frantically, her voice trembling as she shoved a heavy radiological apron over her children's small bodies beneath the massive MRI control desk. Oliver was wheezing terribly, the sheer terror of the sudden sprint triggering his delicate, healing lungs. His chest hitched with every shallow intake of air. Nora fumbled blindly inside her canvas tote bag for the emergency albuterol inhaler she had packed. Shh. Ollie, breathe for me. Deep breath. Look at Mommy. Just breathe. Outside the reinforced door, the muffled but unmistakable sound of heavy work boots crunching over shattered safety glass echoed through the empty corridor. The two men from the Lincoln had bypassed poor Stan with a single, brutal strike, and were now methodically kicking open the doors to the examination rooms, one by one. They're looking for the woman. A raspy, gravel-filled voice drifted through the thin aluminum ventilation grate above Nora's head. It was Silvio, one of Dominic Russo's most notoriously violent enforcers, a man who viewed cruelty as a professional calling. Carmine said they were on the ground floor. Find her and the brats. The boss wants a very specific message left for Calogero. Nora's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Carmine. The name hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Victor's own underboss, the man who managed the estate's security, had sold them out to the wolves. It wasn't just a random hit by a rival gang. It was a calculated execution ordered from inside Victor's own house. She pulled Lily tighter against her chest, her wild eyes darting around the dim, humming room for anything resembling a weapon. In the corner, a heavy, solid steel oxygen canister rested on a wheeled cart. Nora lunged for it, wrapping her aching hands around the cold metal neck. She hoisted the heavy cylinder, her knuckles turning bone white. She was terrified, but beneath the terror burned the fierce, undeniable instinct of a mother cornered. She would not let them take her children. Suddenly, the high-pitched shriek of heavy, armored tires tearing into the clinic's rear loading dock shattered the unbearable tension. Victor's 3-ton Maybach hadn't just parked in the bay. It had violently and purposefully rammed straight through the reinforced security gate, entirely crushing the rear quarter panel of the idling black Lincoln town car. The deafening crunch of crumpling steel and shattering glass echoed all the way into the imaging wing. Victor stepped out of the driver's seat before the luxury vehicle had even fully settled on its ruined suspension. He didn't wait for his backup detail. He didn't call his contacts in the police department. He moved through the shattered glass rear doors of the clinic with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator that had finally been let off its heavy leash. Silvio's partner, a bulky, heavily tattooed man holding a suppressed automatic pistol, heard the crash and turned the corner into the rear hallway just as Victor entered. "Drop it," Victor commanded. His voice was barely above a harsh whisper, yet it carried the absolute, crushing weight of a death sentence. The bulky enforcer hesitated for a fraction of a second, raising his weapon toward the towering man in the bespoke suit. But Victor was infinitely faster, his muscle memory honed by decades of survival in the underworld. Two suppressed shots coughed quietly from Victor's Sig Sauer, precise and devastating. The enforcer collapsed instantly to the floor, his weapon clattering harmlessly against the baseboards. Hearing the dull thuds, Silvio lunged from an adjacent examination room, aiming his weapon blindly down the corridor. Victor didn't even flinch. He stepped smoothly and economically to the side, letting Silvio's momentum carry him forward, and neutralized the enforcer with a single, brutal strike to the shoulder joint. Silvio spun hard to the linoleum floor, crying out in sudden, sharp agony as his gun skittered away into the darkness. Victor kicked the weapon far out of reach and pressed the smoking, hot muzzle of his pistol directly against Silvio's sweating temple, pinning the man to the floor. "Carmine sent you," Victor stated. It wasn't a question. It was a terrifying fact. "He said you were weak," Silvio gasped, clutching his bleeding, dislocated shoulder, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that he was staring into the face of the devil of Alpine. "He said you traded the crown for a suburban fantasy. Russo is moving on the port operations tonight. Calogero, you're already a dead man." Victor's expression remained entirely blank. He knocked Silvio unconscious with a swift, merciless strike from the heavy butt of his pistol, leaving the enforcer bleeding for the local authorities to find. He holstered his weapon smoothly, stepping over the unconscious man, and approached the heavy, locked doors of the imaging wing. "Nora!" Victor called out. The transition was instantaneous. The violent, icy edge entirely vanished from his tone, replaced by a desperate, raw vulnerability that he had never shown to another living soul. "It's Victor. It's over. Open the door." Inside the dark room, Nora dropped the heavy oxygen canister. It hit the floor with a loud clang. Her hands shook violently, her fingers numb as she fumbled to disengage the magnetic lock override on the wall panel. The heavy, lead-lined door finally swung open, and the sight of Victor unharmed, immense, and standing guard in the hallway caused the very last of her adrenaline to violently crash. Her knees gave out, and she fell forward. Victor caught her instantly, his strong, capable arms wrapped tightly around her trembling frame, burying his face in her hair as he absorbed the shock of her near miss. He held her as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. Lily peeked out from under the MRI console, pulling a still wheezing Oliver carefully by the hand. She looked up at the towering, terrifying Mafia boss holding her mother. "You came back, Mr. Victor." Victor pulled back slightly, looking over Nora's shoulder at the two small children who had accidentally, beautifully dismantled his lonely empire device. He knelt down, scooping Oliver up with one strong arm, letting the boy rest his exhausted head against his broad chest. He reached out and gently took Lily's hand, guiding her and Nora out of the ruined clinic corridor. "I will always come back," Victor vowed softly, his voice thick with a profound, unbreakable promise. But as he looked out toward the ruined Lincoln and the dark city beyond, his dark eyes hardened into pure, impenetrable obsidian. To keep this fragile sanctuary safe, the king of the graveyard had to wear his bloody crown one last time. Midnight brought a torrential, unforgiving downpour to the Newark shipyards, washing the thick layers of industrial grime from the stacked cargo containers. Yet, the relentless rain did absolutely nothing to cleanse the impending violence brewing inside Warehouse 4. The cavernous structure smelled of brine, rusting iron, and the sharp tang of wet asphalt. Inside, the heavy drumming of rain against the corrugated steel roof provided a chaotic soundtrack to a hostile takeover. Carmine DeLuca stood near the center of the vast, dimly lit space, surrounded by a dozen of his most heavily armed, hand-picked loyalists, alongside Dominic Russo and his crew. They were finalizing the handover of the Calogero port operations, the crown jewel of the syndicate's logistics network. Carmine took a long, arrogant drag from his imported Cuban cigar, the cherry glowing fiercely in the gloom. He was already celebrating his ascension to the head of the table, his posture radiating unearned triumph. "Calogero is probably still at the hospital, crying over that maid," Carmine sneered, checking his gold Rolex. He tapped a finger against the sprawling port blueprints spread across a wooden shipping crate. "By tomorrow morning, we lock down the offshore accounts and redirect the shipment manifests. The transition will be seamless." Dominic Russo stepped back from the blueprints, his narrow eyes darting toward the shadows near the rafters. The veteran Lucchese Capo didn't share Carmine's bravado. "You talk too much, Carmine," Russo muttered, his voice a low, gravelly warning. Victor isn't a man who just rolls over and dies quietly. If Silvio failed at the clinic, we don't have a seamless transition. We have a war. Before Carmine could bark a rebuttal, the heavy, motorized steel doors of the warehouse suddenly slammed shut with a deafening, metallic boom that rattled the concrete floor. The emergency exit signs sparked, and the overhead utility lights violently flickered before dying completely, plunging the massive space into pitch, suffocating darkness. "Guns up!" Carmine yelled, dropping his cigar as raw, primal panic instantly seized the room. The terrifying sound of assault rifles being racked echoed in the pitch black. A second later, a dozen industrial floodlights mounted on the high catwalks violently snapped on, blinding Carmine and Russo's men in a wash of harsh, unforgiving halogen glare. Standing on the high metal grating, silhouetted against the blinding light like an avenging titan, was Victor Calogero. The rain still glistened on the shoulders of his dark overcoat. Beside him stood Harrison Cole, clutching a tactical rifle, flanked by 40 of the syndicate's most elite, fiercely loyal enforcers who had quietly rallied behind their true boss all afternoon. Seamless, Victor's voice echoed through the warehouse's public address speakers. It was a booming, godlike sound that stripped the air from the room and made Carmine's knees visibly buckle. "You thought you could dismantle my father's legacy, threaten my family, and walk away clean, Carmine?" Carmine shielded his eyes against the blinding lights, his weapon shaking in his grip. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had walked into his own grave. "Victor, listen to me," Carmine screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You were losing focus. The men were losing faith. I did this for the family. You were trading our empire for a civilian fantasy." "You did this for greed," Victor replied, his voice deadly and cold, cutting through the acoustic echo of the warehouse. He slowly turned his gaze down to Russo, who had already lowered his weapon, recognizing a flawless checkmate when he saw one. "Dominic, take your men and walk out of the side doors. Leave New Jersey tonight, and I will let you live to see tomorrow. This is an internal matter. Do not make it yours." Russo didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He gave a sharp hand signal to his crew, and they backed away into the shadows, abandoning Carmine to his inevitable fate. Carmine was left standing entirely alone in the center of the concrete floor, stripped of his borrowed power, his treacherous allies, and his fragile ego. Victor descended the metal stairs with agonizing slowness, his heavy footsteps ringing out like the steady strike of a judge's gavel. "I tried to be a different kind of boss," Victor said, stopping exactly 10 feet away from the man who had stood beside him for over a decade. "I tried to lead with strategy instead of slaughter. I wanted to build something that didn't require constant bloodshed. But you forced my hand. You went after a mother and her children. You brought the war to my front door. They aren't your blood, Victor." Carmine screamed in a final, desperate act of defiance, gripping his pistol but lacking the nerve to raise it. "They are nothing. You're throwing away a billion-dollar legacy for a maid." "They gave me the only piece of my soul I had left," Victor said softly, the absolute truth of the statement anchoring his heart. He drew his Sig Sauer with fluid, lethal precision. "Goodbye, Carmine." The single shot was clean, precise, and definitively final. By dawn, the toxic rot within the Calogero syndicate was purged. Under Victor's unyielding command, Harrison Cole stepped up as the new underboss, implementing a strict, corporate restructuring of their vast assets. Victor ruthlessly and systematically liquidated the illegal gambling operations, the loan sharking rings, and the extortion rackets. He funneled those millions of dollars into their legitimate real estate portfolios and commercial logistics companies. He was entirely done with the street-level poison that had almost cost him everything. He wasn't just ruling an empire anymore. He was building an impenetrable fortress of absolute, untouchable security for the people he loved. 1 year later, the Alpine estate was beautifully unrecognizable from the silent, oppressive tomb it had once been. Bright, golden autumn leaves drifted lazily across the manicured lawns under a brilliant blue sky. In the sprawling backyard, a massive, brightly colored bouncy castle stood proudly on the grass, surrounded by dozens of laughing children from Oliver and Lily's prestigious private school. The air was filled with the sounds of joy, upbeat music, and the sizzling of an outdoor barbecue. Victor stood on the sun-drenched flagstone patio, wearing a casual gray knit sweater and holding a silver spatula. He was expertly flipping burgers on a massive, custom-built outdoor grill, laughing genuinely as Harrison, dressed in a sharp polo shirt, tried and miserably failed to assemble a complex plastic water toy nearby. Careful, or you'll burn the hot dogs, tough guy, Nora teased gently, stepping up behind Victor and wrapping her arms warmly around his waist. She rested her cheek against his broad back. She was radiant, the heavy, hollowed-out exhaustion of her past life completely erased. In its place was the deep, glowing contentment of a woman who knew she was fiercely loved, respected, and eternally protected. Victor leaned back into her embrace, turning slightly to press a tender kiss to her temple. I run a multi-billion-dollar international logistics empire. Nora. I think I can manage a Sunday barbecue without causing a fire. Mom! Victor! Lily came sprinting across the patio, wearing a bright pink party hat slightly askew on her blonde hair. It's time for the cake. Ollie is ready. Victor set the spatula down and securely took Nora's hand, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. They walked together toward the massive, decorated outdoor dining table. Sitting at the head of the table was Oliver, his cheeks flushed with healthy color, breathing perfectly fine without an inhaler anywhere in sight. He was bouncing excitedly in his chair, surrounded by friends. In the center of the long table sat a massive, three-tiered chocolate cake covered in intricate icing. But resting right beside it, placed carefully on a small, delicate glass plate of its own, was a single, slightly squashed vanilla cupcake with a bent blue candle. Victor smiled, feeling a profound, overwhelming warmth radiate through his chest as he looked at the small pastry. He wasn't the lonely king of the graveyard anymore. He was a father, a devoted partner, and a man who had finally, truly found his home. As the children began to sing, Victor looked down at Nora, their eyes locking in silent gratitude. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the greatest, most enduring empire he had ever built was the beautiful family standing right in front of him. Power, wealth, and fear are the currency of the underworld, but they are incredibly poor substitutes for human connection. Victor Calagero possessed everything the criminal world had to offer, yet he was suffocating in his own gilded cage. It took the desperate intrusion of a destitute mother and the innocent empathy of a child to fracture the armor he had worn for decades. This story reveals that true strength isn't found in a loaded weapon or a bank account, but in the fierce, protective instinct to nurture and defend those we love. Nora and her children didn't just survive the Mafia boss, they resurrected his humanity. By dismantling his dark legacy to build a sanctuary for them, Victor discovered that the ultimate power isn't forcing people to fear you, it's finding people who finally remember you.